Now, there are lots of different government systems around the world currently. They all seem to be, at some level, fundamentally flawed. So could there be a better way of actually selecting the government or even choosing a new type of government altogether? Well, firstly, let's go through some of the various different types of governments and see what problems they can create. You may already have thought of many of the government types and also the problems yourself, but these are some of the ones that bother me especially. So as a broad sweep of the candidates, we have democracies, monarchies, dictatorships, communists, and theocracies. Starting with democracies, which does include republics in case people are wondering if a republic isn't a separate type from the others which are listed. A republic is just a different form of democracy, not a separate category all of its own. Democracies, while a brilliant idea in principle, is the practicalities where it runs into a problem. In theory, the public choosing a representative who can make governmental decisions on their behalf is a good idea, but it does require some building blocks for it to work well. So firstly, the public need to make an informed choice, which means they really need to be educated enough and informed enough to understand the issues that they're able to make a reasoned choice when it comes to their representatives. One of the foundations for this requires a free press, especially one that's free from direct government control or government censorship. Since politicians don't like their actions being criticised, a free press is one of the first targets of those who would turn democracy into a dictatorship. Next, representatives will generally be scattered over the country, hopefully relating to the proportions of the populations in those respective areas. This isn't always the case. This proportionality can in turn distort how representative each elected person actually is. These individual representatives will all have their own individual views on what they consider to be the best way to run the country. With most democracies having over 100 individuals being elected to represent the people, attempting to come up with policies and laws and even a legislative program to suit 100 or more individuals, each with their own priorities, is a recipe for disaster. So, to accommodate this, democracies tend to establish political parties, and that's where the trouble really starts. Political representatives in theory form political parties in order to enact policies and avoid chaos. However, the forming of political parties has other consequences. Now, in order to form a party, you need to gather together a group of individuals who have broadly similar views on political policies and objectives. But given the nature of individuals, there will always be some issues within the party where the individuals disagree on elements of the agreed party policy. This will then entail elected representatives making compromises on their political principles in order to remain within the party and exercise political power. Once elected, the representatives that are prepared to compromise their principles in order to exercise power are the ones who are likely to get into power. This concept of having representatives with principles is then undermined, and be further undermined by the steps they need to take to get elected or re-elected. Now, powerful groups within society, from unions, business leaders, religious groups, and other potential lobbyists, can put pressure on politicians to adopt policy contrary to their political principles. In order to gather enough political support to actually carry out their policies, they will actually have to go against things which are contrary to their political principles. The politicians may justify this by saying that though they've made some compromises on one or two issues to get elected, the majority of their principles are still intact. This erosion of principles is a continuous one. It isn't long before some cease to have any individual principles at all, and they're just going along with what the party and the pressure groups want to achieve. In addition, political parties are in business of exercising political power, so they actually want to be the party in government rather than just being a minority party in continual opposition to the ruling party. This can make political parties also make compromises with their principles in order to get power. They may pay attention to opinion polls, adjust policies to what gets most votes, rather than what they think is actually in the best interests of the country. This can then have a major impact in countries where there's a generally poor level of education in the general population, as the public can be easily misled to a negative course of action, which political parties then feel obliged to follow. Of course, the lure of power isn't the only problem with democracies. It also occurs in dictatorships as well. And not all dictatorships start out badly. There's some which are categorized as benign dictatorships, which start out as a means to stabilize a country, normally after something like a civil war or a major shift in government that normally takes a strong leader with wide-ranging political powers to resolve. While the individual has those political powers, they then decide to sort out some other things that they consider wrong with the country at the same time. In ideal circumstances, once these issues have been resolved, the dictator then can step aside and let some other form of government take over. That rarely happens. Instead, the dictator, thinking that they know what all the problems are with the country and what all the solutions are, this feeling of competence is magnified by the previous successes. The more they try to do that actually works, the more confidence they have in their own ability grows, which means they continue to rule once the crisis has passed. And while policies that the dictator is indicating may be fairly popular and have widespread support, there will always be some individuals or even a whole section of the country that are unhappy with some or all of the policies of the dictator. This can lead to protests and a clamour for change. If the dictator does nothing, the protests will possibly grow until it becomes a revolution or an attempted coup. Alternatively, the dictator can accept the demands from the protesters. This may mean that the next group that have a difference of opinion will think all they need to do is stage a protest and the policy will change, resulting in the mob being in charge rather than the dictator. The common alternative is for the dictator to suppress protests either by mass arrests or by sending in the army. This in turn can take protests against the repression, and the dictator can become very unpopular very quickly. In addition to these problems, the group which allowed the dictator to take power may also think they're owed something by the dictator. Often this will be the military of the country may think they're entitled to greater funding or legal exemptions from any activities they've carried out. Failure to assist that group may again result in an attempt to depose the dictator. They may provoke a reaction from the dictator as they attempt to cling to power. As well as these issues, there's also the issue of what actually comes next. The dictatorship is a lone person in power with no standard method of transitioning to a new leader or new government. It may result in the dictator clinging to power by physical and mental powers, making governing the country increasingly more difficult. The alternative is the dictator actually naming a successor to take over when they die or can no longer cope. Of course, the successor may not be prepared to wait, and instead may depose the dictator or start a coup to take over. Possibilities happening may make the dictator reluctant to actually name someone to take over. So when the dictator dies in office, it's normally a period of chaos where various people vie with each other to take over the role of the new leader. Then we have a government ruled by a monarchy, as opposed to something called a constitutional monarchy, which is where the monarch has little real power. Monarchy has lots of similarities with the dictator, but also some unique differences. So, like a dictator, there's a single figurehead in control. But this figurehead doesn't normally have absolute control of a dictator. You normally have to rely on a parliament or similar body. That's most true absolute monarchies now only be seen in history books. Like dictators, there may be laws banning criticism of the head of state, and arrests or detentions for citizens breaking these laws may result in a negative impression of the head of state, much like in a dictatorship. So to prevent a revolution, these powers are normally used sparingly, and instead there will be publicity involving a royal person opening hospitals, giving out money to the poor, other similar actions aimed at boosting their public approval. Unlike a dictator, there's normally a clear line of succession, so everybody knows who will take over if the royal dies. This structured system has a major disadvantage in that the person next in line may not be up to doing the job, and will normally have plenty of education and training what's expected of them, which will help, but birthright doesn't equal competence. It's similar to when major family companies get handed down to the third generation to take them over. Sometimes the firm just collapses as the new leader isn't up to the task. And while the skill of the new leader is a major problem, the clear line of succession is a major advantage. But, like with a dictator, naming a successor, sometimes the chosen person may not be prepared to wait their turn, may try to take over a little early, again causing major disruption. So what about communism as a system of government? Well, now living in the West, communism has had a lot of bad publicity. Some, but not all of this, is well deserved. One of the guiding principles of communist state is that control of the means of the production is by the people. And normally, in a communist state, this is in reality the government itself rather than the people on the ground. There's some serious worries in capitalist countries, as if the state takes control of all the businesses, the owners of those companies will lose all their money and power. This has resulted in many people who are running businesses have tried fairly successfully to discredit the operations of communist states. These business people have even influenced politicians into destabilizing communist states, restricting trade with them, and even fighting wars with their allies or occasionally with the countries directly. So whilst some of the issues of communist states have been overstated, there are some serious issues with them as a form of government. So to start with, the principle that the state is doing what is in the best interests of the population as a whole may mean that individuals involved may not have their best interests considered. So in the early days of a communist government, there's normally likely to be something known as collectivization. This is where the things which were owned by individuals are now taken over by the state and either operated by the state or shared out amongst a group of local people. Commonly, the first thing to be taken over is land, especially farms. So a large farm may have been owned by one landowner, who then paid local people to work on their farm. The state then owns the farm and splits it up, with proportions being given to those who used to be employed working the land. In theory, this should work well, but it comes with a few issues. The starting point is that not all farmland is equally productive, and that someone for the government is going to be deciding who gets what land, which immediately creates the possibility of corruption and favouritism as to who gets what. This sharing can also be related to other items like farm machinery and buildings. Again, it is difficult to divide up evenly. Another thing that's often raised with communist states is productivity of individuals is generally lower under a communist government. This occurs because there's not always an incentive to work harder. It's not always a bad thing though, as being more productive isn't actually an end in itself. Lower productivity can though become a major issue if the country needs to trade with a capitalist country for something which the communist country can't produce. Over time, the communist country will find that due to lower productivity levels, they can end up with substantial trade imbalance, with more goods being needed to be produced in exchange for increasingly expensive imports. Strangely, this trade issue has produced some unexpected political repercussions. While there have been attempts to embargo trade with some communist countries, which actually helped the regimes to continue, as they don't have to sell most of what the country makes in order to import rare, expensive items. Instead, those items are just unavailable. Now, other problems with communist systems are that, in theory, the system is acting for the good of the people as a whole, not with any regard for the individual. So, if for the good of the people, a valley needs to be flooded to provide a reservoir of drinking water and hydroelectric power, and it comes the communist government's policy to flood the valley, and the people in the valley will lose their homes and any farms or businesses that they were running in the valley. They may have been living and working there for generations, replacement jobs and houses being provided by the government, which in turn may not be to their liking. But, of course, protesting against government actions is likely to be treated as a criticism of the communist government, which may in turn lead you to jail or worse. This handling of criticism of the communist government action creates another issue. The structure of a communist government is often a form of head of state with a Politburo under them, who generally tends to rubber stamp whatever the leader says. This can mean that ideas from the leader rapidly turn into concrete action, which may be a good thing, but without having to wait years or months for a committee to vote on them. The authorization of the idea then actually has its own individual momentum. Now, this can mean a flawed idea, even one that's identified as a flawed idea by the people who actually have to implement the idea, will not be changed or altered even though they know it to be flawed, since criticism of the idea can be seen as criticism of the Communist Party itself and be labelled as a counter-revolutionary or similar, and ending up in jail or worse. This can result in a lot of government resources being poured into a bad concept in an effort to make it viable, using up resources which could have been used elsewhere. Now, so last, my short list of potential government types, and there are some others that I didn't want to cover, are theocracies, which are probably the worst types of all government systems. Combining many of the negative amounts of dictatorships, and strangely even communists, and others into a bag and picking out some of the worst aspects of them all. So a theocracy normally has a single head of state with ultimate and virtually unchallenged power, much like in a dictatorship or a communist state. They are given this power by virtue of them claiming to be the voice of God on earth, and like in a communist state, challenging the ultimate power to land you in jail, or in the worst case, given an immediate death sentence. Since this sentence is coming from God via the leader, the individual may not even be given a trial before the sentence is carried out. Laws in theocracy are also likely to be based around some particular holy book which may have been written thousands of years ago. It's likely the holy book hasn't changed with the advance of science or society. However, it doesn't mean that an intimate knowledge of the book will actually help you keep free from issues with the legal system. These ancient books are often filled with contradictions and broad sweeping statements, which can then be interpreted by the leader in whatever way suits their own individual and political purposes. The leader can also potentially ban all other religions other than their one true religion, and make even religious observance in their particular religion mandatory for everyone, turning the religion into a brainwashing cult, with the leader as the figurehead, possibly waging war on the neighbours in an attempt to convert the heathens or infidels into the one true faith. Any criticism of the leader could also be taken as criticism of the god, unless the leader is supposed to be speaking for God, it follows the same path of oppression which is covered in other government types. Once a large part of society has been brainwashed, mere mention of some possible act against their god or the god's representatives could provoke violent retribution from the mob. Now, education in a theocracy, likely based around the holy book, may promote literacy amongst the poorer members of society. It would actively discourage innovation and freedom of thought, as new thoughts can be rapidly labelled as blasphemy. Since all these ancient texts were written by men and administered by men, the prospect of the female half of the population under a theocracy is rather bleak. Also, like a communist system, it tends to divide the world up into them and us, which are likely to foster hostility and possibly even conflict, not something a good government system should be doing. So, with all of these systems having so many problems, is there a realistic alternative? Strange enough, there is another ancient form of choosing a government may avoid some of the pitfalls that I've gone through, but even though the idea and even the application of this system is very old, as many of the other systems, has rarely been tried since the ancient Athens, with Venice being one of the few exceptions. A general method is something called sortition. It can be equated to drawing lots. So the principle is that the name of every adult citizen who actually wants to stand for the position of leader goes into a drawer, and one of the names is selected, and that person then becomes the leader, somewhat similar to the way many countries actually select people to serve on juries. So you have an eligible list of volunteers. The precise nature of what actually makes them eligible can be decided upon by the country. It could be a basic age, citizenship, minimum level of education, along with possibly some medical test. Once the details of these are inputted into the computer, then be selected a random social security number or similar unique identifier, and that person is then free to govern the country for a limited number of years, after which another person is selected by a similar method, and the system keeps on rolling on. Now, the random nature of the selection would mean that the selected person wouldn't be beholden to any political party, group, or influencers, would be free to govern whatever they consider to be in the best interests of the country. This would tend to remove political polarization of the leaders. In addition, the common current traits of leaders like egoism and narcissism would be much rarer and randomly selected people, as they wouldn't need to pay back favours for those who got them into power. We'd also probably need to put in place some structure where the leader was paid a reasonable salary, provided with good accommodation, both during and after their leadership, bribes being attempted to sway a decision during a particular time in charge. Possibly the country could use a confiscation of assets on taking office, so that a bribe or radical change in financial position could be easily detected. It may of course result in wealthier people not wanting to volunteer for the process, but that's no great loss. However, since no one's actually forced to take part, they don't have to volunteer. New leader wouldn't have to have a great genius for politics, but again might be an advantage. Being outside the conventional political system, they would instead be more likely to be in touch with the feelings, concerns, and motivations of the average person in the street and want to do what's best for them. It does rely upon the fundamental principle that the average member of the public is reasonable, fair-minded and balanced. And while that might not always be the case, your chance of finding these characteristics in modern politicians is extremely remote. So the random chance would appear on the surface to be a better option. Any lack of specialist knowledge required by a potential politician could be balanced out by a professional civil service who would be there to implement the policies of the leader. These professionals wouldn't have any political bias, but so wouldn't need to be changed with each new leadership coming in, building up a highly efficient administration system over the years. Key element seems to be what's wrong with the other systems is that leadership goes to the people who really want to be leader. Since sortition result is purely random selection, those who are desperate to become a leader have no better chance than any other individual of actually getting into office. Sortition would potentially involve a switch in some political policies each time a new leader was installed. That switch is likely to be less pronounced than exists with other systems with a change in leadership. The main problem with sortition is that in order for it to actually be used and installed, the method of selecting an existing politician has to actually hand over the reins of power, which means it seems to me a major stumbling block for actually to be introduced in any existing large country and political system.